Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. If you visit umbrex.com/unleashed, you can sign up for the newsletter for the show. If you don't want to listen to every episode, every week I'll send out a newsletter to folks that have signed up at that link, let you know the show notes for the latest episode. I occasionally send some bonus material, so sign up. I'm excited to be here today with Harsh Sahai, who's a McKinsey alum, and he's the CEO and co-founder of Bridgetown Research. And they have built a very cool AI tool that I was fascinated to learn about, and I think you might be interested as well. This is going to be, of course, an audio-only episode. Harsh is sharing his screen with me, and I'm going to be looking at and describing to you what I see as we go along and look at his tool. Harsh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me.
So, Harsh, maybe before we dive into this AI tool that you've developed, tell us a little bit about your firm.
So like you mentioned, Will, I was at McKinsey before, mostly did due diligence work, commercial due diligence work for the past 3 years, with a bit of other PE work kind of thrown in, mostly value creation. Before that, I used to run a machine learning lab at Amazon. The firm that we're kind of building is sort of a mixture of the two. So we convinced some of our former McKinsey colleagues to come join us, and then some of our former Amazon colleagues to come join us and build tools for the consulting industry predominantly.
Can you say a little bit about what your machine learning lab at Amazon was doing?
Yeah, so we were mostly researching sequential decision-making algorithms. So think about problems where you need to make like 10, 20 decisions in a row, and you don't necessarily care about the outcome of each decision. You're more sensitive to the outcome of the 20th decision that you're going to make, which is like, people call it path planning or like decision research, or like it's like a subset of optimization problem. That's largely what we were researching. So it was a pretty research heavy lab that was maybe 1 or 2 years away from anything that actually showed up as a product.
And eventually that would affect things like, what would that kind of be, the order that Amazon displays products to you, or how might they have used something like that?
Yeah, so once you build out one of those like somewhat more generally applicable algorithms, you can like go find use cases across the company. Typical use cases of our research was, how do you figure out how to price something? Because like there's a heavy path dependence of price, like response. People tend to remember old prices and make decisions based on what they remember. For example, if you were to plan out the sequence in which you want to launch products, that's again something that you want to think a few steps ahead. You don't want to think like one product at a time. If you want to think about how does introducing like one type of show on like Prime Video impacts the sales of a bunch of different products, that's again like a multi-step like planning process, where you want to introduce something, you want to learn how the ecosystem got affected, and then you want to like introduce the next thing. You don't necessarily care about like the next 6 months of experimentation. You care about the rest of eternity, when you'd be making money after you've introduced everything. Okay. So those were the main use cases. Yeah.
And I got one more question about your background, which was, it says on LinkedIn that your master's degree at Georgia Institute of Technology was on convex optimization. So I got to ask, what is convex optimization?
So convex optimization is like basically optimization largely refers to, you come up with a model. So there is no such thing as like optimization in the wild, right? Optimization is always in reference to a mathematical model. So you say, this is my outcome variable, and these are the predictors of the outcome variable. And now I can like sort of optimize using this model. So convex is just a type of like that model that you can kind of optimize. It's the most frequently encountered like type of like model that we use to represent all sorts of outcomes in. So if you're thinking about, how do I model price versus volume, probably come up with like a convex function. And then you try to figure out like what's the best price.
And some of those optimization things are about more sequential. Like if you're trying to hire a new employee and there's like a big pool of people, how many people should you interview before you stop and say, okay, this person's good enough, I'm going to hire them, right? Like if you stop at the first person, you think, oh, maybe I missed out some really good people. But if you interview 1,000, you probably wasted your time. So there's probably some optimal number you start at. I guess that's maybe a different type of optimization problem.
Yeah, that's exact. So that is exactly what I was referring to when I said like sequential decision making. The problem you described is actually doubly interesting because two things are happening there. One, like you need to make repeated decisions. But the second interesting thing is like all of those decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty. So you don't quite know who you will find if you like interview just one more person. So now you have to like kind of solve a prediction problem, or like what sort of people are you likely to find if you keep interviewing, and then like an optimization problem, which is like fascinating. That's basically what we were researching.
All right, let's jump to the present. So tell us a bit about the work that your firm does.
Yeah, so what we started off with was we built this platform that can basically automate a bunch of data collection and analyses. And then we could come in and sort of curate those analyses, exercise some judgment, and like deliver value to our clients as consultants. So that was like our initial starting point. At McKinsey, and you're like probably familiar with this, like the way we used to create impact was we would figure out what's the 20% of like the analyses that drive 80% of the value. We'd focus on those analyses and then put those together, get client buy-in, and like stuff like that. What we discovered was there's an alternative way of doing things. If we can automate the analyses sufficiently, we can basically actually boil the ocean. We can do every single analysis under the sun, and then we could go in, exercise our judgment about which analyses actually drove value versus not, and come up with a more robust set of recommendations. So that was like our entire product is sort of based on like this different way of doing consulting. So we've like tried to automate as much of the grunt work as we can. And then all that's remaining is actually exercising human judgment. So the firm specifically does two things. One, it actually develops this software product, these set of AI agents that can, one, conduct an interview at scale at a fraction of the cost, two, run 300 of the most common analyses that most consultants would do to evaluate approximately 10 decisions that we kind of focus most on. And then three, it kind of works alongside you to build compelling documents that are somewhat interactive that people can sort of touch and play with.
So let me just check on some context. I think, so my understanding is from what our last discussion is that your firm primarily serves investors, I think in the software industry, and you're doing something similar to a McKinsey due diligence, right? Where in McKinsey style, you'd call up your favorite expert network and say, hey, we want to do 20 expert interviews, and they would take several days to source experts for you. You're going to pay like $1,500 per expert interview. You're going to spend an hour on the phone with them, probably a senior associate, maybe a senior associate and a business analyst listening in, taking notes. And you're going to take notes on these 20 interviews, and you have an hour, so series of questions. And then you have all these interview notes that you got to go through and, come up with 16% of people said this, and the average, margin people said was this range and so forth from all these interviews. But you guys are taking a different approach. You are like still talking to real people, but you're using an AI agent to do these interviews. Is that right? Tell us a bit about how this AI agent actually does an interview. It's not just going through a straight script of questions, right?
That's right. And if I could like zoom back a little bit, well, what the agents do is like actually broader than just interviewing. So typically the way the software works is you provide 3 to 5 high-level questions. These agents then break down those questions into sub-questions that we are accustomed to answering, where we know like these analyses can like answer these questions. So they first break down the big questions into small questions. The small questions are mapped to analyses. And then for each of those analyses, we try to figure out what are the best sources of data. The best source of data could be Gartner or Forrester or like a third-party source, or the best source of data could be actual interviews. So all of that work is done beforehand. A ton of secondary research is done beforehand. All of that is compiled, and then the agents decide, hey, these data points, we have to go speak to someone for. In that case, these agents are then integrated with a few expert networks. We've got one expert network that we have a very close relationship with. We sort of send an API signal to this expert network. They recruit on our behalf. The agents then have a conversation, which is fully adaptive. The agents are trained to have a conversation very similar to what a consultant would have. So, and I can double click on it a bit more. That's like a really long topic, but they have like a very human-like conversation. They come back, and then all these conversations are parsed out to do the analyses that we had initially planned to answer like the main questions. So,
okay, this is a little bit terrifying for consultants, but it's super cool. So I want to go both at the secondary research. I want to dive into that, but let's talk first about these actual interviews. So I think my understanding is, so the expert network will source real human beings to be interviewed. But the price is a lot lower than a normal human to human interview, because they can do it sort of on their own schedule. So they charge a lot less for that. Right. And you can share, if you're allowed to, like roughly how much, the interview costs versus a live human one, which is normally, something like $1,000 to $1,500. And then what happens? So the expert says, okay, yeah, I'll do this interview. I'm, GLG or Alpha Sites or Third Bridge or whatever firm will, confirms the expert. What happens then? They call a number, and then an AI agent picks up the phone and says, hello, are you ready to go? Walk me through like actually what is going on in that live interview.
Absolutely. I would also love to chat about why it shouldn't be terrifying for consultants. One of the benefits of owning a research platform is you can do a ton of research. So we actually researched this topic quite a bit about how this should impact consulting, like consultants going forward. We have like 1,000 interview transcripts of both people who actually hired a consultant and like consultants. So we'd love to like touch on why it shouldn't be terrifying. But going back to your original question, yeah, that's exactly, you described the process exactly, except the expert networks send these experts a link. They log on to the link. It's very similar to a Zoom link where they're going to have a conversation, which is basically voice-based. There's a few flavors. So you can either have like a purely voice conversation, or you can see a text prompt and then have a voice conversation. So if you're not a native English speaker, a lot of people prefer to actually read the text prompt rather than have this agent with an American accent, like kind of ask them questions about topics that they may not be like immediately familiar with. So like a director of IT that has made like 1,000 sourcing decisions, they love a bit of additional context, which we're able to provide if they use like an interactive screen that has text, plus like you can double click on stuff to get more context on what is the intent of the question.
Okay. So it starts out then a little bit like a traditional survey, right? Like they can see something on the screen, but instead of having to write up their free response, they can just talk. They can just answer the question.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or it sounds like you can also embed in there sort of multiple choice questions or more traditional survey type questions, and the person can click on their screen and do the multiple choice or the ranked sorting or whatever it is. But then it's not just a straight up pure script based survey, right? Because the agent can ask follow-up questions, or might, depending on what they ask or what they say, it can follow a different sort of chain of questioning.
Exactly. That's kind of right. Well, so there's a few things that happen. So every time we construct a question, we also construct a hypothesis of what the answer is likely to be based on everything we know. This is where like the secondary research comes in, and like Gartner and Forrester and everything else comes in. What the agent is trying to do is either prove or disprove that hypothesis. So it's asking adaptive questions to collect enough data to either prove or disprove that hypothesis. If it disproves the hypothesis, it goes back, looks at all the transcripts, tries to come up with a new hypothesis, and then start collecting more data. Or if it like proves the hypothesis, it stops asking the same question to the same type of people. So, and this ties back to your point about cost. One of the reasons why this is so cost efficient is, unlike a regular survey, we don't just ask like 1,000 people the exact same questions, even though like we know what the answer is. We stop asking those questions. Wow. So we've reduced the length like about 20 to 25% once we have statistical conviction. Then there's that impact of flexibility where we kind of get a discount from the person taking the interview because it's extremely convenient for them. And there's a few different levels that we can play with. So for example, if 3 different consultants are looking to speak to the same expert, we don't have to recruit the same expert 3 times and like have 3 separate conversations. We can deduplicate like questions across a bunch of interviews, which again reduces the length by approximately 10% so far, but hopefully more in the future. So all of those kind of bring the cost way down, and we pass the cost benefit entirely on to our clients.
Now, just give me an example of sort of question number 1 and that the agent might ask, and give me an example of a response from a respondent, and then give me examples like 2A and 2B of how the response of an AI agent might change its second question, its follow-up question based on the response. I'm curious to hear how like this responsiveness works.
Yeah, absolutely. So one fairly common question for like all the voice of customer interviews is you ask someone, hey, what are the main reasons you chose this software versus the other software? In that case, the person like gives you a couple of reasons, and then the AI could sort of correlate it back to the previous answers to say like, hey, like you mentioned this KPC. I noticed like the problem that you mentioned earlier that you're trying to solve was B. How does this KPC X like correlate with that problem B? In some cases, how X relates with problem B is like obvious. If someone says like price is an important factor, and like they had mentioned that we're very like price conscious, you don't want to ask a question like how does like price impact price consciousness? So in that case, we'll just move on to the next question. But if they mention something more ambiguous, like we're more sensitive to the upfront cost than the actual total cost of ownership, then the agent would actually ask, hey, is this a working capital like issue? Are you sensitive to like stuck cash? Like why does upfront cost matter more than the total cost of ownership?
Oh, I see. Okay. So that is amazing. So the person is, in some cases, might be on an iPhone or an iPad or a tablet or a computer, clicking their answers, or they can speak to just as if they're doing a Zoom with a person. How have people been responding to the being willing to kind of interact with this voice agent thing? Like, I'm curious, what's the reaction that you get from the respondents?
Yeah, this was one of the things that we were actually a little bit apprehensive about, but turns out that most experts aren't really having those expert conversations for the thrill of speaking to a McKinsey BA. It's mostly like the incentives, and we have like designed the incentives so that they're doing much better than they would in like a traditional like expert network model, and also it's like much more convenient. So the feedback we've gotten so far is fairly positive.
Okay.
Having said that, we also kind of interview maybe on average a slightly different profile than you would as like a consultant at McKinsey.
Oh,
so as a consultant at McKinsey.
How's the profile different of who you interview?
Yeah, so what we kind of realized was we don't necessarily have to speak to decision makers every single time, because there isn't like a director of procurement that is like directly preparing the procurement case, that is like the document that is going to everyone. There's usually an analyst or someone who kind of help the procurement director put together like that document that is then circulated. This analyst usually knows the procurement case just as deeply, if not more, and can recollect more of it than this director of procurement. So what we've kind of done is like we're going more for the mid-tenure professionals, which we do like 10x more interviews of than like extremely senior professionals. We also kind of end up doing a lot of frontline interviews who are like closer to the actual operations of the business. So the data set we kind of get is completely complementary to what you would get in your human interviews. So right. With the expert networks we work with, for example, all the volume that we contribute is like net incremental. There is very little like overlap between who they offer up as like a human interview versus who they introduce like through these tools.
I see. And because it's automated, it'd be impractical for, to pay a McKinsey BA, an associate, to do like 100 interviews of frontline users. But with your tool, you can do that and get that insight from that segment that's sort of untapped.
Exactly. People who like mid-tenure typically are closer to the realities of the operation, but they don't quite have like the full view of the business. So you have to do a lot more of the interviews to stitch together the full picture. But because like we are completely like fully scalable, we can actually do 100 interviews in approximately 3 days, which is the time it takes to recruit those folks, not the time it takes to interview them. And then we can put together like, or help consultants put together fairly compelling projects within a week.
Let's zoom back to stage one, the one that you were telling me about, where before you get to the interview phase, you give the AI tool your set of questions that you're trying to ask. And then you told me how it breaks it down into sub-hypotheses and things it wants to test. Talk to me a little bit about that back and forth. Like, what would an example be of the things that you would put into the tool of saying, here's what we want to learn about? And what are some examples of what then the tool how would that break that down into, more detailed hypotheses?
Yeah. So one of the things our like investor clients particularly ask quite frequently is like, what are the main competitor archetypes? So what are the main types of competitors? Now, in the background, what the agent is doing is saying, what am I trying to explain with these like categorizations? Am I trying to explain like margins of the competitors? Am I trying to explain the go-to-market channel, like strategy of these competitors? What does this categorization actually explain? So it constructs sub-questions that says, hey, let me see what is the segmentation that explains like gross margins of the competitors? What are the segments that explain go-to-market strategy of the competitors and so forth? So it like goes independently and tries to answer each of those questions. And then it eventually comes back and says like, hey, here are some segmentation schemes that explain multiple things. So it seems like the most versatile segmentation. Like if we segment it like these ways, then I can explain like 200 different factors. This is again something that only like a machine can do at this scale. So this is stuff that we fine-tuned to be able to achieve within a matter of days. So in this case, it broke down what is the objective of the segmentation, considered multiple objectives, and then came back and saw like, what is the segmentation scheme that services all of these objectives all at once, and then gave you an example, like gave you 2 or 3 options. And then a human consultant actually picked one of those options.
So you give it the question of, hey, how do we think about segmenting the competitors? Okay. Mm-hmm. And then what would you see kind of its output or its set of questions, like, okay, now I'm going to investigate the following 8 hypotheses, either with secondary research or with questions to respondents. Like, what does that second level look like once you've do the competitor segmentation?
Yeah, so I can give you I can show you a few examples, but that's how you described is exactly how it looks like. It effectively, let me see if I can share my screen. So it basically shows all the work step by step on like what it's doing. But I would also maybe preface before digging into it that it's largely a work in progress. Looking at each step sort of worked when the agent was producing 2 or 3 hypotheses and like chasing them down. Now that we've trained it to do much more work, it produces 10s or 20 plus like hypotheses, and then takes multiple steps to chase each of those hypotheses down. In that case, like tracking and auditing each step is much less practical. So we are trying to figure out how to innovate on the UI UX to sort of make the whole process more tractable. But I'm just looking for like maybe a thread that we can potentially use that already has the work done. I have a bad habit of not naming my chats here. Okay, so this, for example, let me know if you can see my.
Yeah, I can see your screen. So I'm seeing this kind of workflow, this sentiment analysis workflow. I won't mention proper names, but it kind of shows me different stages that it's gone through.
And then each of these stages sort of corresponds to like work it did to get to a final answer. So in this case, what I'd asked was, for this particular company, I want you to read all the Reddit posts, then tell me if the posts were positive, negative, or neutral. For all the positive quotes, give me like some themes and the most representative like quotes. And then for the negative ones, do the same thing. So this is one of the things we kind of do before we jump into a full-fledged interview, which is we scan through public sources. So in this case, for this company, it basically summarized what the main themes were, what the actual sources were. To kind of produce this response, it came up with like this high-level plan that, hey, I'm going to search Reddit. I'm going to see if my search was like successful. If my search was successful, then I'm going to summarize content, and then I'm going to generate like a page that is relatively reusable, which is this page. So it kind of does exactly this. When we click on each of these tasks, we can sort of see some amount of detail on like what was actually happening. Each of these tasks is actually executed by a custom trained model. So if you think about what the agent is doing, it's stringing along a series of custom trained machine learning models so that you can eventually produce like the result. So in this case, the main model was actually the model that categorizes these comments as positive or negative, extracts a bunch of themes, and then like the third custom model was it summarizes the quotes by themes. But that's just one of it. And then again, like this is one thing that we typically do. You can like basically imagine like 300 such analyses that are basically executed by a permutation of 40 or so like fundamental tasks that are each executed by running a custom trained model.
Great. So then this one is kind of almost a little subroutine that goes out and says, let's analyze customer sentiment on Reddit for this particular company. And it goes and finds all of the reviews or mentions of the company, gauges them as positive or negative, pulls out the themes. So that'd be one kind of analysis. Give us some examples of other analyses like this, where an agent is walking through a bunch of steps and collecting information and then giving a result. And the output that I'm seeing is, company analysis. It says mix of reviews, positive, negative, neutral, has the count of each one, positive comments on the left, negative comments on the right, has a sort of a summary of all of the positives and the negatives, and then it has the source, and you can scroll through and actually see the backup of each individual quote. So you can either see the high level, what's the positive theme, what's the negative themes. You can see that's actually pretty nice, because on Amazon or something, if as a customer, if you're looking at reviews, you see the top one, but you don't really know the themes. So it's actually really nice to have the themes of all the reviews. So this was one example. Give us some other examples of, other agents that are off doing their thing.
Yeah. So maybe two categories that I could emphasize. One is like, if you want to reuse these tasks, we can basically, instead of pulling these reviews from Reddit, we can pull them from G2 or the actual transcripts and then produce the exact same page. So that's an example of just another permutation of basically the same tasks. So if I was to ask the agent right now that, hey, like the analysis I'm trying to run is I'm trying to see for all the interviewed customers, what are the themes of like positive themes, negative themes, and what's the ratio? The other example, which kind of relies on a completely different set of tasks, is, let's say I've had a conversation with a bunch of customers, and I'm trying to understand what was the average case buying process, what were the deviations from the buying process, and how frequently did they occur, and three, in the final stage, like the decision making stage, what were the key factors that were considered the KPCs. In that case, I can kind of ask the analyst, build out a standard KPC analysis for me, that we call it the standard KPC analysis on this platform. In that case, there's going to be a couple of actually fine-tuned models that are going to be executed in sequence. The first model is going to be extracting mentions of key purchase criteria across the transcripts. So it will automatically extract key purchase criteria. At that point, the second model will kick in. Not the same people won't just use the exact same key purchase criteria. Some people might call it price. Other people might call it cost. Other people might call it commercial terms. So there's a model that kind of clusters all of these words so that they represent effectively the same meaning. The algorithm is slightly more complicated than that, but effectively it's some kind of clustering. At that point, we trigger the third component, which counts the number of mention by category, and that sort of is your relative importance metric for each of those KPCs. So this is, for example, another set of tasks that can be executed in order to produce a page that is very frequently used when we're doing GDs.
So give me some examples of, beyond the Reddit thing, the secondary research that it would go and kind of independently do before the interview stage. What are some other examples of what it's going out to the world and doing? I imagine maybe making lists of competitors or lists of acquisitions in the industry, or lists of customers, or lists of suppliers. What are the other sorts of things that it's doing? Just boom, day one, it just goes out and sends all these spiders or agents out into the universe for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one way, so there are several points on the platform, several interactions that kind of trigger secondary research. So we don't just do all sorts of secondary research by default. So there are cues the platform kind of takes to know that, hey, this is tentatively the area you're interested in. So let me go do some background research on it. So I can interact with you more smartly. So in this case, when you're creating a new interview, that's a point where we would want to do enough secondary research so that we're not asking stupid questions to the interviewee. We come across as an expert. So in this case, I can say, what are the main competitor archetypes of this company? We can click done. And then at this point, we jump to the second bit where it's saying, let me figure out all the domains that I think are reliable enough to pull secondary analyses from. So at this point, it's going to come up with a bunch of web domains. So here it's come up with a bunch of web domains where we've seen a bunch of blogs that were relatively well regarded. They are well cited. At this point, I can either accept these domains or delete these domains. If I accept all of these domains, I can press done. And at this point, it's saying, okay, I'm reading everything I can read. And now I'm going to come up with, for everything that I could not answer, I'm going to come up with personas of people that I want to go chat with. So it's saying I want to chat with a former employee that has like this background, this geography, this work experience, these roles, some competitor employees, and so forth. If I like click done, it basically does additional background research from all of these domains. So it kind of knows what these companies do in like far more detail, and then puts together like a list of like a question guide that it wants to ask. And at that point, you can give it a bit more guidance on like, here are questions that you should focus more on, here are questions that you should focus less on, and so forth. And
so just to pause you so I can narrate what I'm seeing. While you were talking, it's done the work that would take, when I was at McKinsey, it would take half a day it's come up with 4 different profiles. So it gives the background, it gives the geography, the work experience, the roles that person was in. So that's sort of what you'd be providing to the expert network if I want to source this profile. And then it looks like it's generating the interview guides for each of those separate 4 segments. And that would usually take several hours of fussing around, coming up with questions, and then going back to your team and getting input on it and so forth. Is just doing that in a matter of minutes. And now it's popping up to a new screen, customer, different segments, industry expert on endpoint protection. It goes through as a context of what to, give the interviewee beforehand. It has text of the question. It has some background checkpoints in here. It has a whole series of questions for the person already written up. And I'm seeing you move them around a little bit. So you as the user, as the human, can delete questions if you don't like them. It looks like you can edit them if you can, copy it. And it's even come up with the multiple choice. So it's, what's your familiarity with this blank solution, providers such as A, B, and C. And then it's giving options of, a bunch of other providers. You can add more. You can let the user multiple select. So it's like creating the whole survey, boom, right there for you. And then you can edit it. I mean, that by itself would save a day of effort. And it's even giving you an estimate of how long it would take for the person to fill out the survey. It says like, this would be 13 to 17 minutes right now. So we can take some questions out or add some questions. So
exactly,
that is pretty sweet.
So it puts together this entire guide. You can sort of edit these questions if you want. What these questions are doing is it's informing the hypotheses in a bit more granularity. So it's what's going to happen is in the background, it's going to come up with a bunch of hypotheses for each question, break those down, and then effectively start collecting data to either prove or disprove the hypotheses. Like machine learning, like people will kind of call this like an entailment model, where they're trying to see, has the information provided by the respondent sort of either validated or invalidated the information I have in the hypotheses. So that's what's going on in the background. The flow I'm kind of showing you is the more manual flow, where if you don't trust the AI at all, you want like basically have full control over each step, you can do this flow. More frequently, what we can do is we just ask it to prepare an interview and go interview a bunch of folks without any of this supervision. Really? Because it's cheap enough that we don't necessarily care if like 1 or 2 questions are off.
Just let it rip. Wow.
Just let it rip. And then we can effectively we can click on auto recruit. If we say create panel, it already has everything plugged in, like all the background, geography, work experience, and role, etc. I can name this as a sample panel. I can save it. I won't launch it right now because I don't want to like chat with a bunch of folks about nothing. But effectively, all I do is like hit launch, and there's nothing else I need to do. I can like wake up 2 days later with like a bunch of transcripts that I can then review.
Wow, that's incredible. So you mentioned earlier that consultants should not be terrified. So tell us a little bit about why that's the case. At least it seems like the jobs, if they're not going away, it is going to change. Because if you are someone who all you do is conduct expert interviews, or you're a master at writing interview guides, that skill is quickly going to be replaced by your tool. So what is the role of the human in all this?
Absolutely. So we sort of, to give you like a context on where all this information is coming from, we end up, as we were building out the tool, our objective was more or less to empower change agents to sort of have like a substantial impact in like the client situations they were in, or in like their investment decisions, etc. So what we kind of did was we spoke to a bunch of folks through the tools who had hired consultants as well as like a bunch of consultants. We uh, spoke to people who had specifically undertaken a finite set of project types that we were most familiar with. We knew what was the impact metric of each of those project types. And what we kind of did was study the data as like keeping the project type and the impact metric constant. So saying, hey, for an objectively equally successful project, how much of the contribution did the client assign to a consultant? That was like basically the question we were trying to answer. The conclusion, like skipping like ahead of all the geek speak, the conclusion was there was like three main things that kind of drove the client's assessment of a consultant's contribution. One was the experience and the expertise. So that was a great predictor of clients saying this person had like a huge contribution. The second was authority and credibility. So folks in general with like higher levels of like industry experience, more prestigious positions, for example, like a board position somewhere, etc. Like they were automatically assigned like more contribution, even if like the project was equally successful. And then the third thing that was like somewhat not as intuitive to us was how many connections this consultant had across the organization. So not just with like their primary sponsor, but like in org units other than their primary sponsor, which ended up like explaining a lot of the variance in like the contribution that was assigned to this consultant. So if you think through all these three factors, like cross organizational network, authority, credibility, or like trust, and then experience and expertise, like all of these factors are like inherently human. I don't think like a machine can build like cross organizational network or have like as much authority or credibility or trust, or it can like basically bring human judgment that comes with experience or expertise. So all of those factors we felt like were fundamentally human, and like would like it's incredibly hard to replace. So for that reason, we think that consultants are like here to more or less stay, but like the job would absolutely change. And also I think the type of work that consultants are able to do would like substantially change. There is almost a trade-off between judgment and the volume of data that you can sort of provide to prove your point of view. So if you can provide a huge amount of data to prove your point of view, you don't necessarily need to have like 30 years of experience to have the same level of impact. People would trust you just as much as like a really seasoned consultant, which is like maybe what the change is coming. I feel like mid tenure and like early tenure consultants can probably create more value now than they could maybe like 2 years ago, just because of the volume of data they can source and the amount of analyses they can do that can offset lack of experience, in my opinion. I could be completely wrong.
I guess my take on it is that at that early and mid tenure, it's the tasks that you're doing are going to have to shift from actually, writing the interview guide or conducting an interview or synthesizing interview notes to using the AI tool that you're developing, or competitors of yours, like mastering those tools. So like learning how to sort of almost take a step up of, rather than just writing the interview guide yourself, it's being able to review the interview guide and approve it or edit it, and then kind of synthesize the results that the AI machine is gathering and have some judgment about if they're good or not. So the role sort of shifts from that to like a level up. I mean, within a year or so, people are going to have to be doing that, or they just get replaced with the AI tool that someone else is going to manage. So it's like, learn to manage the tools or be displaced is the message. Now,
absolutely.
Currently, I think you're just using this tool for your own work. Do you have any plans to kind of commercialize the tool or make it available to other users outside your firm to do their own research?
Absolutely. So we are using the tool ourselves, but that's not like a primary source of revenue for us. That's more a source of user insights for us. So we want to make sure the tool is actually adding value, which is why we kind of use it aggressively internally. So we do have like a small consulting type firm, but that's definitely not our main business. Our main business is like basically two parts. One is giving our clients a customized version of this tool so that it's fully integrated with their data sources and can do analyses that resonate more with them. So investors typically have like their go-to analyses and like go-to levers that they want to pull to create value. We can customize the platform to sort of cater to that. So that's the bulk of our work at the moment. We've got a long wait list there. So we haven't been able to prioritize users of the common platform. Having said that, one of my personal goals for 2025 is actually able to onboard maybe small to mid-sized consulting firms to use the product hosted by us without any modification and see if they like it.
Oh, okay. So you're currently private equity investors or other investors are using your tool to do their own research.
Exactly.
I see. Okay. So rather than hiring a consulting firm to do all this stuff, they're using your tool to, do the secondary data collection and the primary interviews and, generate the results directly without hiring consultants.
So yeah, there's like kind of a nuance there. So typically a lot of these investors hire consulting firms when there is a fairly high degree of conviction that they want to invest. That's not the use case for us. They use this tool for pretty much any deal that comes across their desk because it's like that cost effective. It gets you a 60-70% answer without that much effort. If you're further along in the deal pipeline, like you've signed the LOI or like even further, that's when they typically bring in like McKinsey or Bain or someone like that or LEK, which we definitely don't replace right now and don't anticipate replacing anytime soon. We are kind of focusing on like the earlier stages of the deal pipeline. You went to AWS reInvent, you met an interesting company, you want to find out like what's their business model, how they're doing. If that's a company you should track, that's a use case that they'll leverage the platform for.
That's so interesting. I forget the name of that phenomenon, but there's this phenomenon where when something technological change happens and makes something cheaper, people end up using so much more of it that they're actually spending more money in total. So it sounds like investors now are doing research that they would not have done before. They just might have relied on instinct or something. But now that it's cheaper, they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll do this sort of automated due diligence on this thing because it's, so affordable. Where they would not have used consultants before. They just would have just used their gut.
Exactly. So the marginal cost is practically zero. So if you want to do like one additional like mini DD, you don't necessarily have to like pay anything. So in that case, it makes no rational sense to not do it.
Wow, that's incredible. All right. Well, where can listeners find out more about your firm? Where would you point them online?
So listeners can go to www.bridgetownresearch.com or they can send me a LinkedIn message. My name is Sahai. And we'd respond to both. I love speaking with investment professionals, consultants, other professional services. So we also have like a few investment banks as clients and a few law firms as clients. So if you're curious about how our platform can help, please drop me a message and I'll reach back out.
Amazing. We will include those links in the show notes. Harsh, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks so much, Will.